In our last episode, we covered the direct aftermath of the key Battle of Edson's Ridge, the second Japanese offensive in Guadalcanal that caused so many losses for the invaders that it's today remembered as the Battle of the Bloody Ridge. Because of this major defeat, and because they started to feel like they were losing the initiative against their enemies, the Japanese then began to prioritize the Guadalcanal theater, sending almost 17,500 men in their characteristic Tokyo Express to finally win what they perceived to be the most decisive battle of the Pacific War. Today we're going to cover the American attempt to intercept the Japanese express runs during the Battle of Cape Esperance, as well as the recent developments in the air warfare over the Aleutian Islands. As our long-term viewers know, we're big fans of fantasy, sci-fi, space opera, alternative history, and more. And we're happy that we're living in an age where so many fantasy and sci-fi shows and movies are being made. If you share our passion, then you'd certainly like our Wizards and Warriors channel, where we cover the lore of so many universes. For fans of Tolkien's Middle-earth, we just released a 2-hour documentary on the economy of his universe, while another 3-hour documentary describes the War of the Ring in detail, with all of its battles. If you want more, this month we're going to start releasing videos on the history of the First Age of Middle-earth. If you like your fantasy a bit more grim-dark, check out our 2-hour video on the rise and fall of the Targaryen dynasty, a good lore companion for your House of the Dragon binge. At the same time, our ongoing series is covering the War of the Five Kings in the Song of Ice and Fire universe. You want more long videos? Watch our documentaries on the life and battles of Sigmar, on the Nilfgaardian Wars, and the history of the Septim Empire. There's always more. We're currently covering Star Wars lore with a series on the Galactic Civil War, while fans of Warhammer Fantasy should check out our coverage of the End Times period. And those who know what is the best in life are going to enjoy our coverage of the battles of Conan the Barbarian. There's something for everyone, and we're putting all of our love and skill into this channel, so please consider subscribing, watching, liking, sharing, and commenting. All links in the description and pinned comment. On October 10th, General Hyakutake had at last arrived on Guadalcanal to take personal command of the third major Japanese offensive on the island. Yet upon stepping ashore, he was promptly informed about the near annihilation of the Alba detachment and about the loss of the key line of the Manticore and the artillery positions on its eastern bank. This was a huge loss for the Japanese general, as from there he was planning to assemble his forces in preparation for the offensive, and also to launch an important bombardment of Henderson Field. More shocking reports then followed, as Hyakutake was informed as well that the Japanese forces in Guadalcanal received only 1/2 the necessary amount of provisions, leaving them severely weakened from starvation. In that regard, Hyakutake immediately halted the movement of more men in favor of food and ammunition for the campaign, although more reinforcements would be effectively transported in the following days. On October 11th, for instance, there was a planned express run using the seaplane carriers Nishin and Chitose to bring heavy artillery and reinforcements to the island, covered by some short-range Zeros that would fly from the new airfield at Buin, which had been recently completed to give the Japanese more air power in the South Pacific. Concurrently, the Japanese would also undertake a naval bombardment of Henderson Field, sending forward Admiral Goto's 6th Cruiser Division to carry out the shelling of the American airfield. Meanwhile, General Vandegrift and Admiral Gormley continued to prepare their forces for the incoming offensive. The state of health of the American admiral was rapidly deteriorating due to the quick developments of the overall operation and being really pessimistic about the lack of resources for the campaign, and this had been affecting his ability to command for some time now. Admiral Nimitz himself toured the South Pacific in September, taking notice of his poor state and complaining about his lack of initiative to secure the Santa Cruz Islands. Thus, on October 6th, Gormley decided to continue with the plans to secure an airfield site on Indeni, something that was very contested by the US Army, and also to send the 164th Regiment of the Americal Division to reinforce Guadalcanal. Operation Fetlock, the occupation of the Ellice Islands, was also launched on October 2nd, with 3 destroyers landing the 5th Defence Battalion at Funafuti in complete secrecy. On the morning of October 8th, the 164th finally departed New Caledonia, en route to their new destination. They were to be escorted by Task Force 64, consisting of 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers under Rear Admiral Norman Scott, and were further supported by the reinforced Task Force 17 of Rear Admiral George Murray, now boasting the flagship Washington. Scott also had a secondary mission to intercept and destroy Japanese forces moving to bombard or reinforce Guadalcanal. In that regard, he had to develop a doctrine for night surface actions, in which the Japanese knew that they were vastly superior, sinking 8 Allied cruisers and 3 destroyers without a single loss. Scott's battle plan was to steam in a column with destroyers ahead and astern of the cruisers, tasked with illuminating the targets with searchlights after radar contact, while the cruisers used their float planes to find and illuminate the enemy vessels. As soon as they had a target, they were to expertly use their gunnery to decimate the invaders. Yet this plan also had some flaws, as the offensive capabilities of the destroyers were neglected, and he also failed to take advantage of the superior SG radars, placing his flagship on a cruiser with obsolete SC radars instead. By October 9th, Scott would reach Rennell Island, lingering there until he could hear of enemy movements. 2 days later, as the Japanese convoy was approaching Guadalcanal, the 11th Air Fleet finally launched their air raid over Henderson Field, hoping to keep the American planes away from the seaplane carriers. The air battle ended up being fairly inconclusive, but it did fulfill the objective of pinning down the American planes. Yet during the struggle, the Marines would report the sighting of the Japanese convoy, and although they failed to detect Admiral Goto's force, this was enough for Scott to move towards Guadalcanal to intercept the enemy vessels. By 2200 on October 11th, the Americans were around the northwestern tip of the island, as the cruisers launched 3 float planes in search of the invaders, and half an hour later, Scott's ships entered battle formation. 2 of the float planes were eventually forced down, but the last remaining one managed to report enemy presence east of Savo Island by 2330, so Scott would order a course change towards the southwest. Unbeknownst to him, the Helena's SG radar had actually detected a contact at some 27,700 yards away, but this was not reported to Scott, thus wasting a perfect opportunity to achieve full surprise. During the course change, 2 cruisers would also execute an immediate turn instead of following the column, so Scott would fail to maintain formation. Meanwhile, the destroyer Duncan also had a clear radar contact, and believing that the enemy was closing in to attack, it charged alone against the enemy force. At 2342, the Helena at last reported enemy vessels to the northwest in a T formation, placing Goto's forces in the opposite direction than the one reported by the float plane, although this allowed Scott to cross the Japanese T. With hesitation due to the destroyer's position at starboard, the Helena's captain refused to fire without orders, as he was expected to, and instead asked for permission from Scott, finally opening fire at 2346. The sudden ripple of gunfire caught Goto's ships unprepared and unaware, believing it was the reinforcement convoy that was mistakenly firing at them. As Goto drew near, lookouts alerted him that these were American vessels, yet the Japanese admiral still didn't believe the enemy would dare to challenge him at night. The American cruisers, meanwhile, joined Helena in the attack and started to fire at the Alba, although they would also hit some of the leading destroyers at starboard. As the invaders started to turn in a parallel course, the first salvos began to smash Goto's flagship, inflicting heavy damage and mortally wounding the experienced admiral. In the ensuing confusion, the Japanese broke formation amidst a rain of gunfire and then began to retreat. But at 2347, believing that his ships were firing at the leading destroyers, Scott ordered a ceasefire. Some captains didn't heed those orders though, so the Japanese would continue to be hammered down as the Furataka turned to relieve the damaged Alba, receiving many critical hits as a result. At 2351, after communicating with the leading destroyers, Scott finally ordered fire to be resumed. During the fire lull, however, the San Francisco had tracked the destroyer Fubuki, unmistakably identifying its nationality and executing such a strong barrage that the hapless destroyer burst into flames and began to sink. Meanwhile, Duncan rapidly found itself close enough to launch its torpedoes against Furateka. Yet the destroyer was under heavy friendly fire, so it would only get to fire 2 torpedoes before it was set afire by shells from both sides. The vessel would eventually have to be abandoned off Savo Island, and it would finally sink the following day. At the same time, the destroyer Buchanan also launched 5 torpedoes against Furateka, hitting the cruiser once and causing severe damage. In pursuit of the fleeing Japanese, Scott's cruisers would launch concentrated fire over the enemy, scoring over 40 hits on Alba and over 90 hits on Furateka. Although Goto's flagship would be able to survive the battle, the Furateka would at last sink around 0230 due to the sustained damage. The Kinugasa, however, had expertly avoided getting damaged, and around midnight it re-entered the fight by engaging San Francisco with accurate gunfire and by launching torpedoes against Boise. The cruiser's searchlights would further reveal its position, and Kinugasa would score 2 critical hits that inflicted heavy damage and forced Boise to retreat. The Salt Lake City then moved in to cover Boise's withdrawal, engaging the Japanese cruiser in a duel that left her with major fires after 2 hits. In exchange, the Kinugasa only suffered 4 minor hits in the entire battle before they successfully pulled back. Scott continued to press the Japanese until he acknowledged the enemy's withdrawal around 020, when he finally decided to retire. This had been the first Japanese defeat in a night action in the entire war, and they paid dearly for it. Despite this, their reinforcement convoy would be successful nonetheless, landing some heavy artillery that would soon be felt by the Marines. The convoy would then be attacked by a series of airstrikes from Henderson Field, losing 2 destroyers against the Marine planes in the final actions of the battle, and on October 13th, the 164th Regiment would safely arrive at Guadalcanal. Though victorious, the Americans had also suffered many losses, and they would not be in a position to continue to contest the command of nighttime seas from the Japanese in the near future. Furthermore, while the 164th was landing, the IJN launched a strong air raid that rained bombs over Henderson Field from 30,000 feet, thus surprising the American fighters that couldn't intercept them and were then struck while they were refueling. And during the night, as the high-speed convoy of Rear Admiral Takuma Tamotsu steamed towards Guadalcanal, carrying almost 4,500 troops, as well as stocks of ammunition and provisions, Hyakuteke's artillery began to shell the western end of the American airfield, while a strong fleet under Vice Admiral Kurita eased past the south of Savo Island to launch a huge naval bombardment of the American positions, as planned by Admiral Yamamoto. The invaders reported that explosions were seen everywhere, and the entire airfield was a sea of flame during the 83 minutes of bombardment. Firing a total of 973 shells from his battleships, Kurita managed to smash Henderson Field into temporarily unusable rubble, killing over 41 Marines, destroying so many aircraft that only 37 planes were left standing, and burning almost all of the American aviation gasoline. Although General Geiger was then reinforced with 17 SBDs and 20 Wildcats, and a smaller grassy strip was laid down to launch his planes while the main field was out of action, the power of the Cactus Air Force had been crippled, and they could do little to stop the next Japanese convoys, which would successfully land on Tassafaronga to bring more men and supplies. Thus, Hyakutake was ready for his final offensive. But now, we'll head to the Aleutian Islands to continue with our coverage of the Arctic air duel between the Japanese-controlled Kiska Island and the Americans at Alaska. Since we last saw back in early August, many of the resources allocated to the North Pacific by both sides would begin to be redirected to the south due to the importance of the Guadalcanal campaign. Despite this, the Americans believed they continued to enjoy a 4-to-1 advantage in air strength over their enemies, and this encouraged them to start planning for an advance down the Aleutians towards Kiska and Attu. For this, however, they would need to be closer to the Japanese bases to adequately support their offensive with air raids. Because of the region's poor flying conditions, General DeWitt decided to carry out the construction of an airfield on Tanaga Island, which was closer to the Japanese presence, although the island of Adak and its superior anchorage would finally be selected to be the site for the new airfield. In the meantime, the relationships between the American commanders were growing more tense each day, with General Buckner writing a poem about Admiral Theobald that the latter found gratuitously insulting. This almost cost both men their commands, but with the aid of DeWitt, they would eventually find common ground to cooperate again. On the night of August 28th, the Adak operation was at last set in motion, with the submarines Triton and Tuna stealthily moving to the island to land some 38 Alaska Scouts under Colonel Lawrence Kastner. The commandos would then rapidly paddle to Kuluk Bay, where they found no enemy presence, so they would relay this information to Buckner the following morning. Thus, some 4,500 men from the 7th Division, commanded by Brigadier General Eugene Landrum, were prepared to sortie from Unalaska in some 250 transports, finally landing at Adak on August 30th to establish an outpost and begin construction of the new airfield. On that same day, a Japanese submarine snuck into Nazem Bay, stealthily torpedoing the seaplane tender Casco before it was sunk by the destroyer Reed. At Adak, construction of the new airfield was highly prioritized, with many marauders and warhawks continuously patrolling the island from dawn until dusk to cover the engineers as they worked. In just about 10 days, the hard-working Americans would finish their Adak airfield, and on September 10th, the first aircraft would begin to arrive, now being only 250 miles away from Kiska. 4 days later, the first airstrike from this closer location was launched, repeatedly strafing and swiftly dropping bombs over Japanese vessels and installations on the island. Considerable damage was inflicted in result, including 2 minesweepers sunk, yet the bad weather would prevent the Americans from launching more air incursions for some time. Meanwhile, a detachment of 800 soldiers was sent to occupy the nearby Atka Island on September 16th, establishing an emergency fighter landing field there. And on the next day, fearing a probable enemy invasion on the nearby Amchitka Island, Major General Higuchi Kichiro of the Northern District Army would decide to temporarily abandon their outpost on Attu Island to reinforce their position on Kiska. Finally, the Americans would launch their second airstrike on September 25th, in which the Canadian squadron leader, Kenneth Boomer, shot down an A6M2 and became the only Allied pilot of the war to claim both German and Japanese kills. Despite their second successful raid, the Americans would lose the element of surprise a mere 5 days later, when Japanese reconnaissance at last managed to discover the new Adak base. A number of Japanese sorties then followed, before ceasing unsuccessfully on October 5th. On that same day, a survey of Amchitka convinced Higuchi that it was impossible to build an airstrip there, so he would decide to send the 83rd Independent Battalion of Lieutenant Colonel Yonegawa Isumu to reoccupy Attu. Departing from Paramushiro, Yonegawa's men would arrive at the island on October 29th, with reinforcements following over the next several weeks. The last major action of the month would happen on October 16th, when 6 marauders managed to damage the destroyer Hatsuharu in Kiska Harbor. More importantly, they also scored 1 critical hit on the destroyer Oboro, which exploded and sank without survivors, at the cost of 1 lost B-26. But this is it for today. Next week, join us as we cover the Japanese withdrawal across the Kokoda Track and the Australian counter-offensive that would put General Horii's South Seas detachment in great peril. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell button if you don't want to miss the upcoming videos in this series. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.